Hey, it's Drybear. Rounding out my last mercenary leveling build guide before we move on to other classes, and this one is incredibly powerful. Now, we did a grenades build, which is still very strong, and then we did the high velocity rounds build. Both those I have on my channel if you're looking for those, but a lot of people, especially why I like making multiple builds for each class, is it creates a lot of variety that people may enjoy different things about the class overall. So what I was aiming to do was to create an elemental build for the mercenary. There are a lot of elemental abilities early on for the crossbow that are super exciting. Things like permafrost rounds, you can shoot forward ice and freeze a target, and then while that target's frozen, you can use a skill called fragmentation rounds to shatter them and create an explosion. And I really tried hard to make a leveling build out of that combination. Freezing the target, switching to fragmentation and firing, even using multiple crossbows to swap between them with the weapon swap system to create damage. But to be honest with you, compared to my high velocity railgun build or my grenadier build, it just paled in comparison. It honestly just felt like it was moving at a snail's pace and very weak. So after a whole bunch of experimentation and trying to create a build that works for the mercenary, I eventually got to a point where I'm very happy with this build and how strong it is. And this is going to be a lightning focused build for the mercenary. Now you may have to transition into other options, and at the end of the video I'll talk about where I would take this build next if I were to take it into like endgame atlas and mapping and things like that. But this is going to be for focusing on leveling and like leveling up your mercenary as you go along. And the core of this is going to be the amount of projectile damage and lightning damage you have early on in the talent tree. But unfortunately, all of the elemental abilities for the crossbow at the beginning of the game are relatively weak compared to other options. And so what we're going to do is right when you make your mercenary, we're going to immediately pick up a bow and use the lightning damage, like the lightning arrow and lightning rod, to just shred pure damage. Then at level 15, when you unlock galvanic shards for the crossbow, we're going to switch back to crossbow, but continue to use lightning rod until you get to about 35 to 40, where you unlock all of the storm blast and things like that give you a ton of extra lightning damage that will carry you all through this. This build can very easily burn through, levels 1 through 65, get you through cruel, and you'll be ready to go into your end game build. So here's the handy dandy one sheet that I have for this build, the focus and the transition between the different ones. What's cool about this one is you don't need a specific crossbow, you just need to have lightning damage on it and then also increased elemental damage with attacks, which very easily scales up, and you'll have the general layout of the build on the right side here for the talent trees, as well as which skills to use, what levels to transition, and how to put the build together. Now, I'll leave a link to that one sheet down below in the comments and in the description, but I've also rebuilt this on the Mobalytic site, which has a fully functioning talent tree as well, so you have this available here, but the weapon as well, and the skills on top of it. To be honest with you, you really only need galvanic shards and lightning rod until maybe level 40, 45, when you start working in the other abilities that you unlock later in the mercenary tree. And then we have the full talent tree down here at the bottom as well, which should carry you until mid cruel, and you'll start to have to decide what you want to do with the build next. So let's talk about what you're going to do when you first land in on your mercenary at level 1. What we're going to do is we're actually going to pick up a bow. You can find any bow you want. Doesn't really matter, just find a decent bow that works. You'll spend the first few levels leveling up, and again, if you've never used a crossbow or used a just a mercenary in general, what I recommend is until you get a bow, just use crossbow shot. It's actually insanely strong. What it'll do is you'll be able to just load in your normal ammo. So go up here, I can go up to basic bolt. This is your basic attack for your crossbow. Load in that ammo and just use this until you find a bow. It's very basic, very straightforward. It'll do everything you need it to do until you find a bow. However, once you do find a bow, what you want to transition to is lightning arrow and lightning rod, and you're basically just going to be using a bow exclusively until about level 15. And the reason for this, for the skills that are available, honestly, you could do the permafrost into fragmentation combination. It's decent, but it's actually quite slow. You can also do rapid shot as a build up, and this, I would honestly feel rapid shot is better used in a grenade build overall. You can even use things like high velocity round. We've kind of already covered that as a leveling build in general. And honestly, all of these armor-piercing rounds, permafrost, incendiary shot, fragmentation rounds, I think all of them just don't stack up to high velocity or explosive grenade builds as far as being able to clear the content quickly in leveling. So instead, we're going to come over here to bow. We're going to pick up the lightning arrow and the lightning rod available at the first level of skill gem, and we'll use those while we're leveling. All you have to do is put the lightning rods on the ground, and while they're on the ground, if anything gets shocked near the rods, they'll explode and arc and do more lightning. So you'll just be doing lightning shot for the lightning arrow. For this specifically, I love putting Pierce on the lightning arrow just to make it hit more targets and shock more targets, which will trigger more on the lightning rod. And I would recommend getting Scattershot on the lightning rod just because it spreads out 3 at once instead of having just 1, which means you can cast it once and fire into it, and you've got all the damage that you need. However, once you hit about around level 13 to 15, when you get your first level 5 gem, that's when you can pick up Galvanic Shards, which is your first lightning-focused round or ammunition for your crossbow. And this is perfect because then you can just switch to your crossbow. This one just has this firing forward and doing this kind of damage, and it does work with lightning rod. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to keep the bow on the offhand. And what's cool about this as well is it works great for single target and for AoE because you can stack the lightning rods in one place. So you can set this up so you can just put a whole bunch of lightning rods on top of a boss and then fire into them and create a whole bunch of ripple of explosions that deals damage. And what's great about this too is you can actually set this up so that when you have your bow skill on your bar and your crossbow skill on your bar, these will usually default to the weapon that's required to use them. So you'll notice that as I have this, when I press the lightning rod ability, it'll bring my bow out, and when I go to fire my galvanic, it'll bring my crossbow out. It does all natural, it's all part of it. You can just use both of these weapons, and the whole build just works off of that for now. For galvanic, I like running ammo conservation. It by default comes with 5 bolts in the magazine for the weapon, which makes it enough that you can actually fire it and trigger the ammo conservation pretty regularly. You could run double barrel, but it only gives 1 more round. For the loss of reload speed, I personally don't think it's worth it. So I like running ammo conservation with lightning infusion to give more lightning damage and more shock buildup. And then I like finishing that with innervate, which just gives you more damage every time you kill an enemy that's shocked, and that buff will stack up. You'll see a lightning orb running around your character when innervate is active. Then again, I would recommend getting at least a little bit of lightning damage on your weapon on any crossbow you can find. You can even get a dyad crossbow if you want 1 extra bolt being put into your galvanic as well. And I also would recommend getting a high roll on increased elemental damage with attacks, which should help a good bit as well. Now, once you've been playing for a while and you get to level 35 to 50, you'll start unlocking the other options in the kit, which is going to be Stormblast bolts, shock burst rounds, and plasma bolt. And these will give you a nice scaling option. First off, you have the shock burst, which is just a rapid fire elemental. For lightning, this builds up and explodes as well, which is super powerful. You can also pick up the plasma blast as the last level of the skills. It's like closer to like mid-cruel difficulty, like Act 2, you would probably be able to pick this up. But it allows you to build up for a sniper shot, which has a ton of damage potential, especially by the time you get plasma blast unlocked. You'll be kind of close to unlocking endgame, and the amount of lightning damage and projectile damage you'll have for this will be insanely highly scaled. Then you also have the Stormblast rounds, which functions kind of like lightning rods. You'll shoot these here on these people on the ground, and you do need to detonate these. Unfortunately, your best options for detonate these is going to be either the explosive grenade or your explosive shot. Now, switching to the explosive shot is going to be another reload, another fire, but it will give you lightning explosions on top of the explosive shot as well. So you have plenty of options to go into endgame with this build since you have so much built up. Next, let's talk Ascendancy. I think for what you're going to have to do for this build endgame, because honestly, level 55 plus, you're probably going to notice a bit of a drop off in your damage potential with just lightning. I actually am convinced that you'll have to transition this build into a multi-element build, probably with ailments and other things like that. And you have some really cool combinations that allow you to play around with swapping between elements, doing kind of triggers that swap between exposures, and you can even do something where over here is where I'm thinking endgame, you'll have to swap between ammunition types as well. But once you get everything for lightning, you'll probably feel like you might have to add something else to it. But for the Ascendancy, I think because you're going to have so many skills, I love the Gemling Legionnaire for this. And personally, what I would do for your normal run, Act 2, you'll unlock 2 Ascendancy points, and then Act 3 in normal mode, you will unlock 4 Ascendancy points. And I would just come up here, get 3 additional skill slots, and then get the 2 copies of Support Gem in different skills. There's some really easy pickups for these, like things like ammo conservation are going to be really strong for this if you have multiple bolt types, which is going to be really cool. Or really even getting Scattershot on multiple skills could be really strong as well. Next, let's talk about the passive skill tree like the transformation from level 1 as you move along, and why this build works so perfectly for Mercenary. When you start here, I would highly recommend skipping the defense. This is going to make you a little bit weaker than some of the other builds. Like my Grenadier build, my Railgun build will have these nodes here, which means it's a lot easier to deal with bosses. But as you get better at the game, you're going to start needing some damage for this build specifically. So what I would do is I would start with projectile damage, come down to attack speed for these two nodes, and then come back to projectile damage. The reason we do attack speed is twofold. The first is the fire rate on Galvanic will be affected by this, which is actually very useful on the multi-bolt ammunition types. But secondly, what you don't know about the crossbow is the spin-up time. Like the pre-fire time before the crossbow starts firing is affected by the attack speed. So you shoot, and then when you reload, that time right there, you notice as I'm reloading and I'm waiting to fire, attack speed will alleviate that a little bit. So for this build specifically, you really do want to get some attack speed to make it feel better. And since we have it available at the beginning, we're going to grab that and go. So we're going to grab here, go down to this. We're going to get the free strength and dexterity and projectile damage. And then we're going to go ahead. We're going to grab here and we're just going to beeline out of the starter area as fast as possible. You probably will need at least one node on intelligence and at least one node on strength for the skills you're going to be trying to add. So then you can grab those here immediately, and then you can grab some dexterity on the way down. Then right at the starting area, we're going to go here and we'll grab this whole lightning node, and you combine the attack speed with the projectile damage and all the lightning we have here. It gives you a huge burst in power in the beginning of the game. So we're going to get lightning damage all through here. Then we're going to get shocking hits, have a chance to shock enemies in an area. So when you shock someone, it shocks everyone. Shock is a debuff that is a damage amp on the target, which is super nice. Then we're going to get increased electrocute buildup and buildup on both of them. So shock is a damage amp debuff, electrocute is a stunning debuff, which helps with clearing big groups of enemies and rares and champions or uniques or rares and magic enemies alike. And this is going to be around the time that you're going to be able to get galvanic shards online, is like around when you get to this point. So you're going to start transitioning into crossbow. There are some decent options here, and I feel like late game you probably will want to go to weapon swap speed, but we're going to skip that for now and just come down here. And I think you want to go ahead and immediately come over here, get this jewel slot, and then pick up the crossbow reload speed, as it makes a big difference on a build that uses primarily bolts from the crossbow. Once you unlock this jewel socket, you want to try and pick up a jewel. There's some really easy ones that give you a ton of extra availability early on. Things that have damage with crossbows, lightning damage, or increased reload speed make a big difference early on. So if you can find a jewel like this, or if you're not solo self-found and you want to trade for one on the trade site, you can do that. And getting crossbow reload speed with damage or lightning damage makes a big difference early on top of getting a boatload of reload speed with this altogether. It would make night and day difference. Then as you transition into normal through cruel as well, what I would do is just finish out the availability of damage you have right next to this. Not only did we kind of come over here just to get the reload speed, but we also have a ton of available damage options here. So what I would do is I would come down from this node, get the elemental damage from these, and then go ahead and grab all of these penetration, lightning damage, and lucky rerolls for advantage rolls and things like that, plus more lightning damage. And then you can come back and you get increased chance to shock or electrocute. You can get more penetration for lightning, more elemental damage, and also increased elemental damage when you have a flask up. So this set of nodes and these set of nodes will take you through into cruel difficulty, and you'll be set up pretty. At this point, you have a couple options, and it depends on what you're planning to do for your end game build. If you want to transition into an ailment build, like I said, you can grab these nodes here. You can grab this node and grab this cluster here, and potentially even come down to some of these options down here, or try to go into the other options that you have, like these nodes available, or this node here from the ranger side of the tree to finish the build out. But at this point, you're going to be clearing close to end game or starting your end game journey, and you'll have to figure out what your end game build is. This build is focused primarily on just doing the early game. And from there, this is a segment that people had asked for on my other leveling builds, is like just general thoughts on where I think I would take the build. Obviously, it's not something I've tested myself, but it's just where I would take the build after this if you were to use this build up until 65 and then go into endgame. And like I said, I think this build probably best translates into a multi-element ailment build with multiple bolts and swapping between them, because by the time you get to endgame, you have increased swapping speed, you have increased reload speed, and you have a lot of functionality from your ascendancy available to you that would make a big difference in making this build work. So where I would go from this, because I'm starting to get the feeling that the single element of mercenary is going to fall off pretty hard towards endgame. I could be wrong about that. You could do lightning all the way through to endgame with really strong bursts, heavy pen, and you just try to avoid lightning resistance, but it starts to feel like lightning starts to fall off a little bit towards the end game, and there's so many options for multi-element for mercenary based on their setup. So one of my favorites here would be coming down to the crossbow area. You can increase damage with crossbows, which should have a double dip on that, into the chance to not consume a bolt, so free ammo conservation for this. But the big thing is here, you get 25% increased damage with crossbows for each type of ammunition fired in the past 10 seconds. This allows you to fire one type of crossbow bolt, swap to a new one, fire, swap to a new one, fire. You can even play with things like innervate, which is a option here as well. So if you were to come here and grab innervate, hourglass, you can actually get more damage, but add cooldown to a skill. If you have hourglass and you put it on a bolt and you fire, you will be prevented from firing that bolt again for 10 seconds. But you can actually get multiples of these, especially if you go with the gemling copy for support in your build as well. So you can actually just cycle between bolts, adding 25% overall damage across the board for each ammunition type, swapping. And if you have the reload speed from here, these two 30% increased reload speed on jewels, reload speed here as well, plus the weapon swap speed. This is a 90% weapon swap speed. So your ability to swap and reload is so incredibly fast once you've got all of these put together that you're able to swap between bolts pretty consistently. You'll also notice that once you have these nodes here, the elemental nodes here, these nodes here, you can even come down for some electrocute buildup and shock buildup down here, but you kind of run out of options for going into elemental. However, right next to you in the ranger tree is some really strong options for multi-element. You can even come up here to this segment, which has increased chance to shock, additional elemental, more elemental damage. There's even things down here where you deal increased damage when you hit an enemy that is afflicted by an ailment, and you've already grabbed this node down here, which increases your chance to ignite, your chance to freeze, your chance to shock, and your chance to electrocute. So you can run a build where you do like galvanic shards, fire, switch to permafrost bolts, fire, switch to your fire shards, fire, and you're cycling bolts, applying all of those ailments, giving yourself damage for each ammunition type, giving yourself damage for every ailment that you have. You have crazy high ailment buildup and higher ailment damage and magnitude of ailments. You can even come back up here and get the increased chance to do ailments, as well as break armor from ailments. And I think that would be a really strong way to transition this electric build into a late game tri-element build for using the mercenary. But again, since everyone has asked me to do leveling builds instead of hyper polished end game builds, I'll leave that for another day for me to explore in a different video. But I just wanted to leave at least my thoughts on where I would go next if you were to use this build all the way through. So that's the Galvanic leveling build for mercenary. I think at this point we'll move on to other classes, because I think these three builds, the Galvanic, the Railgun, and the Grenadier, are all very competent, very powerful leveling builds for mercenary if you wanted to level them 1 to 65 to get them into endgame, and then use your endgame build from there with explanations and details on how to play them. And let me know what you think and what we should cover next in the next video. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.